Picture this. It's 1951, and you're flying over the frozen wasteland of the Yalu River, the jagged border between North Korea and China. This stretch of sky has earned a nickname that strikes fear into the hearts of pilots on both sides: MiG Alley. For the Soviet pilots of the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, this should have been their moment of glory. These weren't rookies fresh out of training. These were hardened veterans who had survived the brutal dogfights of World War II, men who knew every trick in the book. They'd been secretly deployed to Korea, hidden from the world, flying the MiG-15, a machine that was supposed to be untouchable. When the MiG-15 first appeared in the skies, it sent shockwaves through the West. This wasn't just another fighter jet. This was a silver arrow, sleek and deadly, with swept wings that cut through the air like a knife. On paper, it was superior to anything the Americans could throw at it. It climbed faster than any American jet. It could reach altitudes where the air was so thin that enemy planes would choke and stall. And those cannons, those massive 37mm beasts, could tear a bomber apart with just one direct hit. The Americans, meanwhile, were flying the F-86 Sabre, and sure, it was a beautiful machine, elegant and well-designed. But in this specific moment in history, it was outmatched. The Sabre couldn't climb as fast as the MiG. It couldn't reach the same heights. The laws of physics seemed to favor the Soviets. If a Soviet pilot ever found himself in trouble during a fight, the solution was simple: pull back on the stick and climb. The MiG would shoot up into the thin stratosphere where the American Sabres would gasp for air and fall away, powerless. It was like having an escape hatch built right into the sky, a guaranteed way out of any dangerous situation. But then something impossible started happening, something that would send ripples of confusion and fear all the way back to the Kremlin in Moscow. It started on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in late spring. Captain Nikolai Sutiagin, who would eventually become the top Soviet ace of the entire Korean War, was leading a formation of 4 MiG-15s on a routine patrol. The weather was perfect, crystal clear with unlimited visibility. Below them, the rugged Korean landscape looked like crumpled brown paper stretching to the horizon. Then Sutiagin spotted them. A formation of American Sabres flying far below, maybe 5,000 feet down. This was the setup Soviet pilots dreamed about. The tactical manual was crystal clear on this one. Dive down on the enemy. Hit them hard with those powerful cannons. Then use your superior climb rate to zoom back up to safety before they can even react. It was a classic boom and zoom tactic, and it had worked perfectly in training. Sutiagin signaled the attack. The 4 silver MiGs rolled over in dove, their engines screaming. The speed built rapidly, 600 miles per hour, then 650. The airframe shuddered as they approached the sound barrier. They screamed down on the American formation like hawks diving on prey. The Sabres broke hard, scattering in all directions like startled birds. Sutiagin picked his target, lined up the crude optical gun sight, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy cannons thumped, sending bright tracer rounds arcing through the sky. He missed. The deflection angle was too steep, the closing speed too fast. But that was okay. He had plenty of energy. He pulled back hard on the stick, feeling the crushing G-forces slam him into his seat. The MiG-15 responded beautifully, its engine roaring as it converted all that diving speed back into precious altitude. He shot upward, fully expecting to see the American Sabre falling away below him, unable to follow. But when he glanced back, his blood ran cold. The Sabre wasn't falling away. It was following him. This made absolutely no sense to the veteran Soviet pilot. The Sabre was heavier. It had less powerful engines. Basic physics said it should be bleeding energy and stalling out by now. Yet somehow, Impossibly, the American pilot was hanging on, matching his climb. But the real shock, the moment that would haunt Sutiagin for the rest of his life, came a split second later. He was now thousands of feet away, twisting in a high-G climb, presenting a small and difficult target. At this range, hitting a maneuvering jet fighter with machine guns should have been statistically impossible. The human eye simply cannot judge lead distance accurately at these speeds. The vibration of the aircraft, the wind drift, the bullet drop, there were too many variables for any human brain to calculate in a fraction of a second. And yet, tracer rounds flashed past his canopy. These weren't wild spray-and-pray shots from a desperate pilot. They were terrifyingly accurate, surgically precise. A stream of .50 caliber rounds slammed into the wing of his wingman's jet. Smoke erupted instantly. The hit was perfect, achieved from a distance and angle that should not have been possible. Sutiagin watched in absolute horror as his wingman's MiG spiraled down toward the frozen earth below. He wasn't angry yet. He was bewildered, confused on a level that shook him to his core. He knew the capabilities of the Browning machine, guns the Americans used. He knew their effective range. That shot should never have happened. It was like a ghost bullet, a one-in-a-million alignment of pure chance. He aborted the mission immediately, diving back toward the safety of the Chinese border airfields, his heart pounding not from the physical exertion of combat, but from the deeply unsettling feeling that the rules of aerial warfare had somehow changed without anyone telling him. Back on the ground at Antung Airfield, the scene was chaotic. Other Soviet pilots were landing, their faces pale and drawn, their hands shaking as they lit cigarettes with trembling fingers. It wasn't just Sutiagin. Across the entire sector, Soviet pilots were reporting the exact same inexplicable phenomenon. They would engage the Americans, use their superior vertical performance to escape just like the manual said, and they would get hit anyway. Ground crews swarmed around the damaged MiG-15s that had managed to limp home. They examined the bullet holes with growing alarm. The hits were grouped tightly together, clustered in small areas. This was the hallmark of a trained sniper, not a dogfighter desperately spraying lead while pulling high-G turns. To achieve groupings like this on a target moving at 600 miles per hour while pulling multiple GS required a level of marksmanship that simply did not exist in the known world. The debriefing officers demanded answers. Did you slow down? They asked the shaken pilots. Did you fly straight and level? No, the pilots insisted, their voices rising with frustration. We were maneuvering the whole time. We were climbing hard. We were way outside their effective range. The political officers, the commissars who were attached to the unit to ensure political loyalty and ideological purity, grew suspicious. They began to suspect cowardice or incompetence. They could not accept the possibility that American equipment was somehow performing impossible feats. They accused the pilots of letting the Americans get too close, of not being aggressive enough. But the veterans knew what they had seen out there. They had seen tracer rounds curving toward them from distances where the American plane was barely visible, just a tiny speck against the endless blue sky. It was as if the American bullets were being guided by some invisible hand, some supernatural force they couldn't understand. Now, you have to understand the position of the Soviet Union at this exact moment in history. It's 1951. The entire world is balanced on a knife's edge, teetering on the brink of nuclear annihilation. Joseph Stalin is still alive, still in power, and his paranoia has reached absolutely terrifying levels. The war in Korea isn't just a regional conflict. It's a proving ground, a testing arena where the two superpowers can measure each other's strength without triggering World War III. If the Americans could dominate the skies over Korea, It meant their bombers could potentially penetrate deep into Soviet airspace. It meant that the massive, incredibly expensive air defense network the Soviet Union was frantically building, a network that relied heavily on the MiG-15 as its primary fighter, might be fundamentally flawed from the ground up. The MiG-15 had been their ace in the hole, their secret weapon that was supposed to level the playing field against overwhelming Western numbers and industrial capacity. If the Americans had somehow found a way to swat these supposedly superior jets out of the sky with ease, then the entire balance of global power had shifted catastrophically overnight. Reports began trickling up the chain of command, climbing higher and higher until they reached the desks of the most powerful men in Moscow. The language in these classified reports was careful and guarded, filled with military jargon designed to soften the blow. No one wanted to be the unfortunate messenger who delivered bad news directly to Stalin. The reports described unusually aggressive American tactics and surprisingly high accuracy rates. But between the carefully chosen words, anyone who knew how to read them could sense the barely concealed panic. The loss rates were climbing week by week. In the early months of the war, when the MiG-15 first appeared, it had forced American B-29 bombers to completely stop flying daylight missions. It had genuinely terrified the U.S. Air Force leadership. But now, slowly but surely, the F-86 Sabre pilots were clawing back the advantage. They were racking up kill after kill, achieving success rates that seemed to defy the performance charts and engineering specifications of their aircraft. A dark and terrifying theory began to take root in the officers' mess halls at Anton. Soviet pilots started whispering it to each other in low voices, afraid to say it too loud. They said the Americans must have developed some kind of new weapon. Maybe it was a proximity fuse for their machine gun bullets, something that would detonate the rounds near the target even without a direct hit. Maybe it was some new type of supervelocity ammunition that traveled so impossibly fast it required almost no lead calculation at all. Or perhaps, and this was the most chilling thought of all, the Americans had developed some revolutionary new way to control their aircraft that the Soviets simply couldn't understand or replicate. Every time a Soviet pilot climbed into his cockpit now, the confidence was completely gone. The arrogance that came from flying a superior machine had evaporated like morning mist. They would look up at the sky and see not freedom, but a trap waiting to be sprung. They knew that if they made even a single mistake, if they accidentally entered what they were starting to call the zone around the American jets, they would be destroyed by that uncanny, almost robotic accuracy. The zone, that's what they started calling it among themselves. It was like an invisible sphere of death surrounding each American Sabre. If you entered it, you died. It didn't matter if your plane was faster. It didn't matter if you could climb higher. If you were in the zone, the Americans simply did not miss. General Georgy Lobov, the commander of the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, found himself under immense and growing pressure from Moscow. The Kremlin wanted results. They wanted dead Americans and safe Soviet pilots flying home after every mission. Instead, Lobov was writing letter after letter of condolence to grieving families back in the Soviet Union, watching his best and most experienced men vanish into the rugged hillsides of Korea, never to return. He ordered a dramatic change in tactics, thinking he had identified the problem. Get closer, he demanded in his orders. Do not fire until you can see the rivets on the enemy aircraft. He genuinely believed the problem was Soviet marksmanship, that his pilots were opening fire from too far away while the Americans were showing better fire discipline and waiting for point-blank range. He was completely wrong. The confusion and fear reached an absolute breaking point when a highly experienced flight leader, a man who had survived brutal combat against the German Luftwaffe during World War II, engaged a lone American saber in what should have been a textbook kill. The resulting fight was a vertical rolling scissors, an incredibly complex and nauseating maneuver where two aircraft spiral around each other in 3 dimensions, each pilot trying to force the other to overshoot and present a clean shot. The Soviet pilot executed the maneuver absolutely perfectly, exactly as he'd been trained. He forced the saber out in front of his nose. But when he pulled the trigger, confident of the kill, his heavy cannon shells went wide, missing completely. The optical gun sight in his MiG-15 was bouncing and vibrating too much from the high-G maneuvering. He had to guess the lead distance, and his guess was wrong. The American saber reversed direction. It seemed to defy the energy state it should have been in based on the physics of the fight. It pulled its nose around with what looked like sluggish, heavy movement. Yet somehow the saber's nose ended up pointed directly at the Soviet MiG. The Soviet pilot broke hard, yanking the stick and pulling 5 GS, the blood draining from his head. He knew he was safe. The deflection angle was too high for any possible hit. Then the tracer rounds arrived. They stitched a perfect line across his fuselage, severing critical hydraulic lines. The flight controls went completely dead in his hands. He ejected, tumbling into the freezing slipstream, and as his parachute opened, he watched the American saber fly calmly away. It hadn't sprayed bullets wildly in all directions. It had fired one short, controlled 2-second burst, and seemingly every single bullet had found its mark. This wasn't luck. This wasn't chance. This was a system, a technology, something they didn't understand. The Soviets realized with growing horror that they were fighting a ghost, battling something they could not see, something hidden inside the metal skin of the F-86 Sabre. And until they could figure out what it was and how it worked, the slaughter in MiG Alley would continue unabated. The mystery was no longer just a tactical problem to be solved with better training or more aggressive flying. It had become a strategic emergency that threatened the entire Soviet air defense doctrine. The Kremlin gave the order directly. Find out how the Americans are doing this, find out why they never seem to miss, and find out fast. The desperate hunt for answers began in earnest, but the Soviet investigators were looking in completely the wrong places, searching for new guns or revolutionary engines, having absolutely no idea that the secret lay in something far smaller and infinitely more sophisticated than they were even capable of imagining at that point in history. The mystery had now moved from the frozen high-altitude battleground of the stratosphere down to the muddy, frozen ground of North Korea itself. The Soviet Union mobilized its formidable technical intelligence apparatus with a level of urgency and resources usually reserved only for stealing nuclear secrets from the West. They formed special recovery teams, elite units that were definitely not ordinary infantry soldiers. These teams consisted of highly trained engineers and intelligence officers from the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Directorate, accompanied by Chinese security forces who knew the local terrain. Their orders were brutally explicit and came with the unspoken understanding that failure would likely result in a death sentence. Bring us an intact saber, whatever it takes. Every single time an F-86 went down over enemy territory, which thankfully for the Americans was quite rare, these recovery teams would scramble into action. They would race against time and against American combat search and rescue helicopters, often dodging heavy artillery fire and airstrikes, desperately trying to reach the smoking crash sites before the Americans could destroy the evidence. The Americans knew they had something critically important to hide. U.S. Air Force doctrine was crystal clear. When a Sabre crashed behind enemy lines, Navy Corsairs and Sky Raiders would often be dispatched within minutes to strafe and napalm the crash site into oblivion. They would rather burn their own cutting-edge technology to ash than risk it falling into Soviet hands for analysis. This scorched earth policy only deepened Soviet paranoia and convinced them even more that the Americans were hiding something revolutionary. What could possibly be so valuable that they would destroy their own expensive aircraft to protect it? Then, in the deep winter of 1951, a Soviet recovery team finally managed a critical breakthrough. An F-86 Sabre took battle damage and crashed in the tidal mudflats near the North Korean coast. The thick mud extinguished the post-crash fire immediately, and crucially, it preserved the aircraft. The American pilot managed to eject successfully and was picked up by a U.S. rescue helicopter, but the machine itself remained behind. The incoming tide rose up and covered the wreckage, hiding this precious prize from American spotter planes flying overhead looking for the crash site to destroy. Under the cover of total darkness, hundreds of Chinese laborers working alongside Soviet technical advisors managed to drag the broken carcass of the jet out of the sucking mud. They loaded it onto a flatbed truck, covered the distinctive shape with hay and tarps to hide it from aerial reconnaissance, and began the dangerous journey north. They crossed the Yalu River under cover of night, finally reaching the sanctuary of Manchuria in Chinese territory. The recovered Sabre was immediately loaded onto a heavily guarded train bound for Moscow, specifically for delivery to the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute and the top-secret weapons development bureaus. The dissection began almost immediately. Soviet engineers swarmed over the damaged aircraft like surgeons performing an autopsy on an alien creature. They carefully stripped away the skin panels. They removed and examined the engine in microscopic detail. But the ballistics experts and weapons specialists went straight for the nose section of the aircraft. They desperately wanted to see the guns, to examine the magic weapon that was swatting their supposedly superior MiG-15s out of the sky with such ease. What they found was initially deeply disappointing and confusing. They carefully extracted 6 Browning M3 machine guns from the nose. They completely disassembled each weapon on the sterile white examination tables of the laboratory. They precisely measured the barrel rifling. They tested the spring tension. They conducted detailed metallurgical analysis of the firing pins and internal components. The technical report that eventually landed on Stalin's desk was utterly baffling to everyone who read it. These were not superweapons at all. They were essentially the same .50 caliber Browning machine guns the Americans had used extensively during World War II, just slightly modified to fire at the higher rate of 1,200 rounds per minute. They were actually quite crude and simple compared to the sophisticated 37mm cannons on the MiG-15. They relied purely on kinetic energy, simple lead bullets punching holes. They weren't firing explosive shells or anything exotic. The Soviet engineers stood around the disassembled guns, genuinely confused and frustrated. "This is it," they asked each other in disbelief. "This simple weapon is what's killing our best pilots?" They turned their attention to the ammunition itself, examining hundreds of rounds in microscopic detail. They found standard ball ammunition, tracer rounds, and incendiary rounds. Nothing unusual. No proximity fuses like the ones used on anti-aircraft shells. No guidance systems or computer chips, which didn't even exist yet. No secret rocket propellants or experimental explosives. If the gun itself was relatively primitive and the bullets were completely ordinary, then the magic, the secret, had to be in the aiming system. The investigation's focus shifted dramatically to the cockpit. The canopy was badly shattered from the crash impact, and the instrument panel had suffered significant damage from both the crash forces and the corrosive salt water of the tidal flat. But there, sitting prominently atop the instrument panel behind a piece of armored glass, was a mysterious black box, clearly some kind of gun sight. The technicians carefully pried it loose from its mounting. It was labeled with American military designation A4CM. To the untrained eye glancing at it quickly, it looked like a fairly standard optical reflector sight, just a piece of glass where an aiming reticle would be projected, similar to what the Germans had used during the war and similar to what the Soviets themselves currently used in the MiG-15. But when the engineers carefully opened the protective casing, they discovered an absolutely shocking density of complex wiring and delicate vacuum tubes that looked far less like a simple gun sight and far more like a miniature computer system. The device was packed with incredibly delicate gyroscopes, sophisticated magnetic amplifiers, and an intricate spider web of electrical circuitry that boggled their minds. However, disaster had struck during the crash. The delicate internal gimbals, the precision spinning mechanisms that kept the gyroscopes stable and functional, had been crushed and mangled by the violent G-forces of impact. The fragile vacuum tubes were shattered into glittering fragments of broken glass. The Soviet engineers could see what the components were supposed to be. They could identify the individual parts, but they absolutely could not make the system work. They couldn't power it up to observe the mysterious ghost phenomenon that their terrified pilots kept reporting from combat. They attempted to reverse engineer the electrical schematics by tracing every wire and connection. During this painstaking process, they made a significant discovery. This site was connected through a cable to a small radar antenna intake mounted on the nose of the Sabre. Radar ranging, the chief engineer muttered, suddenly understanding part of the puzzle. They're using radar to automatically measure the exact distance to the target. This was indeed a significant and important finding, a genuine technological advantage. But critically, it led the Soviet investigators to a dangerous and fundamentally incorrect conclusion about how the American system actually worked. The Soviets assumed, quite reasonably based on their own technological understanding, that the radar simply told the pilot precisely how far away the enemy aircraft was, perhaps automatically adjusting the size of the aiming reticle to compensate. They had similar conceptual designs on their own drawing boards for future systems. But here's what they completely missed. A range-finding radar alone, no matter how accurate, does not explain the lead calculation problem, the incredibly difficult challenge of predicting exactly where a maneuvering enemy aircraft will be 2 full seconds in the future when your bullets finally arrive at that point in space. Frustrated by the damaged hardware, the investigation took a darker turn toward human intelligence. In the grim, cold interrogation rooms of North Korean prison camps, captured American pilots were brought in for questioning. These men were exhausted, many were wounded, and all of them were understandably terrified of what might happen to them. The Soviet interrogators, speaking through translators or in broken, heavily accented English, didn't initially ask about troop movements, strategic targets, or nuclear weapons codes. Instead, they asked obsessively about the black box, about the aiming system. "How do you aim your guns?" the interrogator would demand, leaning forward intensely. "Do you use the rudder pedals? Do you manually calculate the deflection angle in your head?" The American pilots, who had been strictly briefed before their deployment to say absolutely nothing about the classified A-series gun sights under any circumstances, either played dumb or, in many cases, gave answers that were entirely truthful. They genuinely didn't really understand the technical details of how the system worked. "I just put the aiming pipper on the target and pull the trigger," one exhausted pilot explained simply. This answer absolutely infuriated the Soviet interrogators. Liar, they would scream, slamming their fists on the table. At 600 miles per hour, if you simply put the aiming point directly on the target, basic physics says your bullets will pass harmlessly behind him because of the time delay. You must lead the target. How do you calculate the proper lead angle? The pilot would insist, with complete honesty, I don't calculate anything. The box does it for me. The system does it automatically. The box does it. This simple phrase filtered back through intelligence channels all the way to the Kremlin, and it took on an almost mythical quality. The box does it. The legend continued to grow and mutate. In the mess halls and ready rooms of Soviet air bases, pilots began to mythologize the American technology into something far beyond its actual capabilities. They stopped calling it a gun sight. They started calling it the electronic brain, as if it were some kind of artificial intelligence. Wild rumors flew in every direction. One increasingly popular theory claimed that the Americans had somehow connected the targeting radar directly to the aircraft's flight control systems. Soviet pilots became convinced that once an American pilot achieved radar lock on a MiG, the F-86 Sabre essentially flew itself, becoming a kind of robot assassin. They imagined the American pilot was really just a passenger, sitting there passively until a light turned red, then simply pressing the trigger button when the computer told him to fire. This theory was particularly terrifying because it completely removed the human element from combat. You could outfly a man through skill and experience. You could trick a man with clever tactics. You could even scare and intimidate a man into making mistakes. But you absolutely cannot scare a gyroscope. You cannot trick a mathematical calculator. You cannot intimidate a machine. Another widespread theory suggested that the electronic brain could somehow see perfectly in total darkness and even see through thick cloud cover. This led to genuine panic during missions in bad weather. Soviet pilots who would normally feel relatively safe operating in heavy overcast conditions now felt completely naked and exposed. They would imagine the Americans' radar eyes somehow piercing through the fog like X-rays, calculating the perfect kill solution while the Soviet pilot flew blind through the clouds, unable to see the threat until the bullets arrived. The Soviet leadership, growing increasingly desperate for any kind of countermeasure or solution, ordered their own aviation industry to immediately copy the American technology. They pulled out their own current gun sight, the ASP-1N, and examined it critically. Yes, it was technically a gyroscopic sight, that much was true, but it was painfully slow and primitive. The design was actually a direct copy of a British wartime system from World War II. When a Soviet pilot pulled hard on the stick to make a sharp turn during combat, the aiming reticle in his sight would lag noticeably behind the turn, wobbling and drifting. It would take a full 2 or 3 seconds to settle down and stabilize. In the middle of a high-speed dogfight, 2 or 3 seconds might as well be an eternity. By the time the Soviet gun sight finally settled and gave a stable aiming solution, the enemy target had already moved to a completely different position. The Soviet analysts made another critical assumption based on their own technological limitations. They assumed that the American sight must suffer from exactly the same physical limitations. After all, physics is physics everywhere in the universe. Gyroscopes naturally drift and wobble. That's just how they work. So the Soviet technical experts concluded that the Americans must have developed specialized flying techniques to accommodate and work around the limitations of their sight. They issued a new tactical directive to their combat pilots. The Americans must be flying very smoothly and gently to allow their electronic sight to function properly. Therefore, if you fly in wild, erratic, violent maneuvers, you should be able to confuse their computer and cause the gyroscopes to tumble and give false readings. This became the new official doctrine, taught at every briefing. Shake the saber. Make it uncomfortable. Fly in aggressive, unpredictable, energy-bleeding maneuvers to crash or confuse their targeting computer. This created a terrible and tragic irony that would cost many Soviet lives. By flying these wild, violent, constantly changing maneuvers, Soviet pilots were actually bleeding off their airspeed, wasting their one genuine performance advantage, the MiG-15's superior climb rate and energy retention. They were making themselves significantly easier targets, not harder ones. They didn't realize, they couldn't possibly know, that the American gun sight didn't need the target to fly smoothly at all. They had no way of knowing that the specific technological innovation hidden inside that mysterious black box was specifically designed and optimized to handle exactly the kind of chaotic, violent maneuvering they were now deliberately performing. Back in Moscow, the pressure cooker of political tension finally exploded. Joseph Stalin was absolutely furious when he received the latest combat reports. The loss ratios were completely unacceptable to him. For every single American saber shot down, the Soviets were losing far too many MiGs, though the precise ratio was kept as a closely guarded state secret. The trend was undeniable and deeply alarming. The investigation had reached a complete stalemate. Yes, they had recovered wreckage, but it was too badly damaged to function or test. Yes, they had interrogated pilots, but the Americans were either keeping silent or genuinely didn't understand the engineering behind their own equipment. Yes, they had developed elaborate theories, but these theories were based primarily on fear and speculation rather than hard scientific facts. The Soviet military and political leadership had become absolutely convinced that the F-86 Sabre was essentially a robot aircraft, that it represented a triumph of American electronic wizardry and automation over Soviet aerodynamic engineering purity. This created a deep psychological complex of technological inferiority that would haunt the Soviet military establishment for decades to come, influencing design decisions and strategic planning long after the Korean War ended. They became obsessed with electronics, automation, and computing, convinced they were decades behind the Americans in these critical fields. But here's the thing they didn't understand. They were looking at a mechanical marvel just as much as an electronic one, a brilliant piece of analog engineering that solved an impossibly difficult problem in an elegantly simple way. As the calendar turned to 1952, the nature of the air war gradually changed. The Americans introduced an improved version of the Sabre, the F-86F model. And with this new variant, the mystery somehow deepened even further. The kills became even cleaner and more decisive. The engagement distances increased. The accuracy improved even more. The Soviets found themselves fighting an increasingly defensive war. They stopped aggressive offensive patrols deep into North Korean airspace. They stayed at high altitude, refusing to descend into the deadly zone unless absolutely forced to by direct orders. MiG Alley, which was supposed to be an impenetrable killing ground for American bombers, had somehow become a death trap for Soviet fighters. But the true nature of the device, the actual secret of how it worked, remained frustratingly elusive to Soviet intelligence. They remained convinced it was some form of radar-guided autopilot system. Soviet aerospace bureaus were already preparing to spend billions of rubles developing elaborate counter-radar jamming systems to blind the F-86. They were about to waste precious years of research and enormous resources chasing completely the wrong technological ghost. Because the real secret wasn't primarily in the radar at all. The true secret was in a small, precisely engineered spinning component that could solve the hardest mathematical problem in aerial combat, calculating firing solutions almost instantaneously. And while the Soviets were frantically searching for complex electronic systems and sophisticated computers, the Americans were winning air battles with a piece of absolutely brilliant analog mechanical engineering that had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. And the answer to this baffling mystery was sitting calmly on a laboratory workbench, not in some secret military bunker, but in Cambridge, Massachusetts.